I think, look, people, because of what happened last season and because of what happened in the 3-point shootout the year before, I think people have lost sight a little bit about the impact that Kevin Huerter had on this roster. And when I had conversations with people within the walls of the team after the season, they were more of the like, look, Kevin Huerter had a bad season, but we don't think Kevin Huerter's a bad player, and we think that like we know who he was the year before, and there's potential for him to get back to that player, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, maybe he's not the 15-point per game guy, but he's not the 10-point per game guy. Maybe he's in the middle there, like a 12, 13-point per game guy, but still an elite, like gravitational pull shooter, right? And so there's a possibility that Kevin Huerter like gets going and finds a way to get like right into that that type of player. And I would point out too that Kevin Huerter at 6'7", like he can play the 2 and the 3. And at this point, like, could you see a weird lineup where it's De'Aaron Fox, DeMar DeRozan at the 2, Kevin Huerter at the 3, Keegan Murray at the 4, and Domantas Sabonis at the 5 to start the season? Like, yeah, I could see that. Like
this, that's the starting lineup.
Well, yeah, but like if you have DeMar DeRozan, who's not a great 3-point shooter, and you know that you have the De'Aaron Fox, who improved and became a much better 3-point shooter last season, you need as many shooters on the court as possible. So, especially with Sabonis, I could see them looking at Kevin Huerter and saying, okay, why not start him at the 3? Why not start him alongside Keegan Murray? Now, defensively, sure, you might have some problems, but I'd make the case that in the same way that I used to with Buddy Hield, like I think Buddy Hield, just because he's 6'4", was like defensively miscast as a shooting guard. Defensively, like his awareness and everything else out in space at the top of the key, where he can be like manipulated by either a big man coming up and setting screens or just a better athlete running at him, like wasn't an ideal situation. But Buddy was big enough and strong enough that if you put him on small forwards, he was actually pretty solid as a defender. And you're also taking away a lot of the court when you put him on guys who are on the wing versus guys that are at the top of the key. I think that could be this similar case for Kevin Huerter, where if you put Kevin Huerter, like maybe not on the super long, super crazy athletic, not the Brandon Ingrams of the world, but a lot of other players, I think that Kevin Huerter might be able to hold his own as more of a 3 on the defensive end than, so I don't know what they're thinking. But at this point, like Kevin Huerter isn't a bad player. And I think that if you can kind of like forget about last season and let him establish who he is this year, it's possible that he could be a better player than what you could have got for him. And the other problem that you have if you're Monty McNair is I know I see people bringing up like beef stew and stuff, like Isaiah Stewart from the Pistons, right? But here's the problem, that if you take Kevin Huerter and you trade him for him right now, then what happens if Kyle Kuzma does come up for grabs? What happens if you can put a package for Brandon Ingram mid-season if the Pelicans aren't doing well and they're like, man, we got to get off this now, we got to bail? Then you don't really have that trade chip that you do as of right now. And so you have to be cautious as well with how you're sort of looking at your trade packages. Cause like, again, you traded Sasha Vezenkov, you traded Davion Mitchell to Toronto in a salary dump, and the salary dump looked great, but how do you use that salary? And so far they haven't.
So let me, you said a lot of stuff I want to touch on there.
Yeah.
Kevin Huerter on the roster for sure.
If Monty's saying they're done, that this is who he thinks they're going into camp with, then maybe. But then again, this could just be, putting something out there in the media to make sure that people know, yeah, we're totally comfortable with this as our roster.
Now so let's roll with that. Kevin Huerter on the roster, because I've been operating that he was going to get traded. He hasn't yet. It doesn't sound like he's going to, but again, never say never. It's on the table, but let's assume he's going in. The biggest question I have with Kevin Huerter is not even defensively, because I think defensively the Kings have the horses to take some of the defensive burden off of him in a way they couldn't before Keon Ellis kind of burst on the scene, right? The question I have now, though, is you laid out that lineup where Kevin Huerter is starting, that Fox, Huerter, DeRozan, Keegan, Sabonis lineup.
Mm-hmm.
If that's not the lineup, if it is, hey, they came to an agreement with Malik Monk and they decided that they have the pieces now to allow Malik Monk to start, or if they say no, DeRozan has to be at the 2, I'm sorry, Keon has to be at the 2, DeRozan has to be at the 3, and Keegan has to be at the 4, and Kevin Huerter's coming off the bench. Is that a role that he's going to accept? Because I think that was a big problem for him last year. And I think that was the reason we saw him shoot a career low percentage, was because his role was threatened at the beginning of the year, and then he struggled coming out of the gate. And so there was all this questioning about, is he going to get traded? What's wrong with him? And I just don't think it was like a smooth season, particularly coming off a rough playoff series to end the year prior. So he was in this situation last year where he never really got stable, never really got forgive the phrase here, but got his feet set. And now, if he's in a spot where the Kings are going, yeah, hey, you're going to be coming off the bench, and also you're going to be in every trade rumor for the entire year. Like, I don't think that's setting him up for success.
No, I'm with you, and I fully understand that. I would say this, though. Kevin Huerter was coming off a career year last summer. Like, people forget he was the Kings' 3rd leading scorer the year that they had the highest offensive rating in the history of the game. Like, he literally was their 3rd scorer, and so incredibly consistent. He had one lull in the middle of the season where he was bad shooting wise, and then he snapped out of it and kept going. But I think he went into last offseason, and he talked about this a little bit in his postseason wrap up. He said, look, what I did is I worked on the offense that we're playing in. I worked on those, like extending out off the high dribble handoff, the DHO. Like, he's like, I worked on that a lot. I worked on how to play off of Domas and all these things. He's like, and then I got into the season, and teams took that stuff away from us. And I had spent the entire offseason kind of just working on the things that would have made me better in that system. He's like, so this offseason, I'm going to go back to the basics of what I typically do, which is just try to work on my overall game and be a better basketball player. And so that's one thing. But I also think that Kevin Huerter walked into last summer thinking, okay, like, I didn't have a good playoff series, but hey, neither did Harrison Barnes, neither did Name That King. There were plenty of guys who didn't have a good playoff series.
Sure.
And he walked into the summer believing he was going to be the starting shooting guard come training camp. And then in training camp, they had brought in Chris Huerter, and next thing you know, it for some reason became a competition. Chris Huerter gets hurt, then it's not a competition. But I think the psyche really threw Kevin Huerter. So what I'm hoping is that Kevin Huerter, number one, has been working with somebody all summer long on this type of situation. Like, what we saw from Kevin Huerter, a lot of his issues, there was nothing physically wrong with Kevin Huerter until late in the season when he dislocated his shoulder. Outside of that, like, the mental aspect of the game got to Kevin Huerter. And like, I'm not speaking out of turn here. There's no question he had a hitch in his shot and all kinds of weird mechanical issues that came up out of nowhere. None of that was physical. There was nothing wrong with him that would have caused that. It was all mental. And I'm hoping that he's worked on that. It's not just about jumping higher and shooting the ball better and being in better physical shape to run faster and run further. Sometimes it is about understanding roles, understanding your place in the league and your place in the hierarchy of your team, and really taking a step back. And I'm hoping that that's what we've seen, that's what we'll see from Kevin. So what I'm saying is that I think he'll be better prepared physically. We know he was at Coachella with
Bottle
Domas,
Rock,
right?
I think.
Bottle Rock. My bad.
Accuracy.
Yeah, no. Bottle Rock. My bad. Bottle Rock with Domas. We know he's been around his teammates here and there, but at the same time, you're really, really hoping that he's coming in with the understanding of, like, anything can happen in the NBA. Just because you're making $17 million a year doesn't mean you're a starter anymore. You know, it could mean like they just brought back Malik Monk and paid him more money than you make to be the sixth man, most likely. Yeah. And so, like, realistically, this was probably a wake-up call season for Kevin Huerter, and whether it positively or negatively impacts him going forward, we'll have to wait and see how he responds. But I'm not like just ready to throw Kevin Huerter out and say, hey, look, man, you're not a good basketball player anymore. You don't need to be here. But he can be a means to an end. Right. And by that, I mean, he can be the piece that's moved in a trade. The Kings probably had an option of who they wanted to trade, whether it was Harrison Barnes or it was Kevin Huerter. And it was probably the difference between going between two different teams when they're completing the 3-team swap for, for DeRozan. Yeah. So like there's a good possibility that this is a guy that they chose. Right. And that's good. Like if this is a guy that they chose to be around and they think that his 3-point shooting and like his ability to stretch the defense, like makes sense for this team. Okay. Because it did 2 years ago. It was phenomenal to watch.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's tough, man.
I think on this roster, I'd rather have Harrison.
Maybe.
I think in a vacuum, I'd rather have Huerter, but I do wonder, if the Devin Carter injury changed the Kings' thought process on Huerter at all. Because if you have a healthy Devin Carter, which the Kings won't until January at the minimum, you have at the 2, or players who can play the 2, Malik Monk, Devin Carter, DeMar DeRozan, Keon Ellis. I could just, it feels like Kevin Huerter's spot is at the 3 specifically, and I'm not totally sure where that, if that's going to be right for him and if that's the right fit.
Well, I definitely, when you talk about the Devin Carter injury, I think it does change everything. I mean, whether he was going to play 24 minutes a game or he was going to average like 16 to 18, that's still a big role that you just lost. And, you know, again, they went down, they got Jordan McLaughlin to sort of fill the backup 3. But if you're just looking right now at realistically, you can group players in different areas, right? But if you're looking at your backcourt being De'Aaron and Malik and Keon and Jordan and maybe Colby Jones, well, that's not enough.
Yeah.
Right. And because if I'm going to group those guys together and then I'm going to look at the small forward spot and say that's kind of DeMar DeRozan and Kevin Huerter, and I'm going to look at the power forward spot, I'm going to say that's kind of Trey Lyles and Keegan Murray, and then Jalen McDaniels is going to be your fifth forward there, right? That's kind of your team. If you throw in Devin Carter, it does mix things up pretty substantially. And it adds a ton of depth. But at this point, like they do need to use those last 2, or at least one of the last roster spots to try to add some other size at some position. And so, it's kind of intriguing, Kyle, like the roster build of this thing, it doesn't feel done. And so when you hear Monty McNair say something like that this is a team that they're going to take into camp, it does feel a little bit like, okay, this is what they're going to take into camp. Are you hearing that out there, Washington Wizards? This is a team we're taking into camp. Like, are you hearing us? Because that's what we're going to do. We're not going to give you 2 first-round picks
that we're taking into camp.
Yes.
Maybe some smaller moves, like a signing. No trade.
Yeah.
Washington.
We're not giving up 2 first-round picks, Washington. But we're ready to move forward. Yeah, so that's what it kind of
always open.
Yeah, I would just say, like, if you were to add one other piece, it changes everything. Excuse me.
Yeah, it definitely does.
Yeah.
Real quick on the Lauri Markkanen front, it sounds like that's a done thing for the Kings. You mentioned earlier, you know, wanting to hang on to Huerter in part because of how he might be able to potentially impact the lineup, but B, for a potential midseason trade. Brandon Ingram, it looks like he's going to hang out in New Orleans, at least for the time being. It doesn't sound like the Jazz are super interested in moving off Lauri Markkanen, and maybe the Wizards, who just signed Jonas Valanciunas, are still under this impression that the back end of the East is really weak and they're going to be able to go make a real push for a play-in spot. But it sounds like the Kings are off of Markkanen. And there was some reporting in The Athletic today from Shams Charania. This I just thought was really funny. On the Markkanen stuff. The Warriors have discussed a trade proposal with the Jazz around Moses Moody, multiple first-round picks, multiple pick swaps, and multiple second-round picks. The Jazz countered with an offer of Lauri Markkanen for Moses Moody, Jonathan Kuminga, and Brandon Podziemski, along with picks, which surprisingly has been a non-starter for Golden State. So it doesn't shock me at all that that's something that the Kings probably punted on, because if that's what the Jazz want from the Warriors, I can't fathom what they would have asked for from Sacramento.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard that the Kings had a competitive offer on the table that did not include Keegan Murray, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a competitive offer.
Competitive in what sense, though? Competitive in the general trade market sense, or competitive in the Danny Ainge is an insane person sense?
Yeah, and that's always going to be the problem. And the worst part is we're talking about a guy who's not under contract moving forward. Mm-hmm. So, and who is people have been pretty clear to people that he would really, really like to explore free agency this summer. Mm-hmm. And to give himself like an opportunity to go. He doesn't feel like he really had a good free agent experience the last time, and mm-hmm. that he was kind of left out of the cold in the free agent world, and had to sign with Cleveland on like a make good contract for a guy of his level of skill. And mm-hmm. then he made good. And so like he wants to figure out free agency and play where he wants to play. Mm-hmm. Well, that's like a giant red flag. Why would you give up multiple first-round picks and multiple pick swaps for a guy who won't commit? And if he's not going to commit to you, then like, what are you doing? So the deal is if they sign him on August 3rd, right? By August, well, is it August 3rd? They have an exact
time in the beginning of August.
Yeah, they well, maybe it's August 6th. There's one day that they have to sign him, and they have to do a renegotiate and extend, like what the Kings did with Sabonis. Mm-hmm. If he gets that contract on that specific date, 6 months he has to stay on the roster. That equates to trade day.
Yes,
the actual trade deadline
day of the deadline.
And you can't trade him until that day, and you can't trade him after that day. So it's like this really weird dynamic that's in play.